November 1st, 1950. The air is cold and thin above this mountainous landscape. It is 4 months after the start of the Korean conflict. The United Nations Air Command consists mostly of warbirds left over from another conflict, which ended just 5 years before, the Second World War. This afternoon, 5 aircraft, an English Mosquito bomber, and 4 Mustangs are patrolling near the Yalu River. It is mostly routine. There's no significant threat posed by the tiny North Korean Air Force. After initial reverses, the UN forces have staged a stunning comeback that placed them well into North Korean territories. Ahead lies the Yalu River, the border with China. And this question, with the defeat of the North Koreans impending, will the Chinese intervene? Control of the skies above the rugged Korean landscape had belonged from the start to the U.S. Air Force and United Nations allies. North Koreans piloting propeller aircraft had proven no match for the P-51s and their pilots, many of whom were combat-tempered veterans of World War II. But in the last weeks of October, there were reports of new aircraft amassing across the Yalu in Chinese territory. Modern F-80 jets had been assigned to fly interdiction raids and stood ready to defend against a more aggressive adversary. But was this show of force just a bluff? What would happen next?
Yo, Mickey, won't fret. Only at 2 o'clock. I went up to meet him. Jesus, that thing's fast. I've never seen anything like that before. Mosquito, this is squadron leader, and I'm going to cover you. I'm going to try another shot. Let's get out of here.
This was it, the new Russian MiG-15 jet, a light single-engine fighter known as the world's first operational swept-wing jet. 6 days later, on November 7th, the MiGs came up to meet our F-80s from the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing. 2 things were made clear that day. First, the MiG-15 with its swept wings, based on captured World War II German research, was a decidedly superior aircraft to our frontline F-80 Shooting Stars. And second, our seasoned pilots possessed skills superior to the communists. But how long could courage and skill hold out? The tense political situation placed us in a dilemma never before experienced by American combat forces. China was off limits. Just north of the Yalu River were sanctuary air bases where the communists amassed their planes. Taking off and pulling up to high altitudes while still over China, the MiGs crossed the Yalu at 30,000 feet, diving down onto our propeller-driven B-29s at speeds nearing Mach 1, and then disappeared as fast as they had arrived back across the border into China. Suddenly, this was a new war. American air superiority could no longer be taken for granted. In one quick stroke, the MiG had rendered every American plane in the Korean theater obsolete. What would America's answer be to this dramatic demonstration of technological superiority? This represented the 3rd time in recent memory when our armed forces had been surprised by new fighters in the field. In spite of warnings from the men of the Flying Tigers, many were surprised by the revelation of the Japanese Zero at the outset of World War II. Near the end of that war, the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had shocked P-51 pilots as it sped past them. Now here was a new swept-wing threat, fully 100 miles per hour faster than our frontline F-80 Shooting Star. Once again, the ball was in our court. Fortunately, America's answer was poised, ready for action. Already in limited service back in the States was a new jet, the first example of an aircraft that would make history around the world, the North American F-86 Sabre. The Sabre created the name and form of what was to become one of the most famous family of aircraft of any era. The story of the F-86 begins in the late days of World War II, when North American Aviation, makers of the famous P-51 Mustang, proposed several possible designs for a jet fighter to the Navy. In May 1945, a contract for 3 prototypes was produced. About the same time, the Air Force decided they would like to develop a plane along similar lines. And North American designers were asked to evaluate German research data on swept wings for the program. The Navy balked at this proposal since it required a considerable delay in the delivery date. But in November, the Air Force gave the go-ahead to this radical departure, thus clearing the way for the development of America's first swept-wing jet fighter. These new orders took North American designers back to the drawing boards. It was created, starting with a fuselage Navy plane, but gracefully at 30. Research and technical data, and the F-8 was 2 years away. Continued plane, straight wing FJ-1, which was succeeded by the swept wing FJ-2, 3, and 4. But none of these planes were produced in large quantities. The Sabre eclipsed the FJ series. It alone was destined to set the combat aviation world afire. 1947 was a year of changes. In September, as the Army Air Force was reorganized into the United States Air Force, and on October 1st, 1947, the XP-86 flew for the first time. The following May, the first 2 aircraft were delivered to the new U.S. Air Force. In the hands of Air Force test pilots, this powerful and gleaming bird swept aloft. Its J-35 engine thrust it to speeds of which pilots, just a few years before, could only dream. Like the later Mustangs, this bird was delivered in all its sleek silver-skinned beauty, and for good reason. Later tests of F-86s in camouflage paint lost fully 20 miles per hour from their top speeds. The pilot could climb to his cockpit with the aid of a folding ammunition bay door and a neatly recessed foothold in the side of the fuselage. The high subsonic speed of the F-86 demanded a new hydraulically assisted flight control system. The sliding bubble canopy provided a full 360-degree view. The aft fuselage featured 2 lateral dive brakes that could be extended for landings. The F-86E model introduced aerodynamic wing leading edge slats to improve handling at slow speeds. Putting it through its paces, there could be no doubt. This was the outline, the shining blueprint for the future of jet warbirds. Prior to delivery, a contract for 188 aircraft was signed using the designation P-86A. In April 1948, the Sabre, flown by test pilot George Welch, broke the sound barrier, surpassing Mach 1 in a shallow dive. In June, just as the first production Sabres were being rolled out, the Air Force changed its designation from P for Pursuit to F for Fighter. F for Fighter, a new designation for a new plane. The F-86A Sabre was delivered. A fresh chapter in the jet age had begun. It was just the start of an exhaustive study and improvement process that would carry military aviation forward for years to come. Almost immediately, the next order of Sabres was upgraded to the new J-47 series of engines with 5,200 pounds of thrust. Later modifications included a J-47 series with an afterburner installed in the F-86D. The Sabre was armed with 6 nose-mounted 50 caliber machine guns. When outfitted for ground attack missions, it could be fitted with wing-mounted rockets or 2 500-pound bombs. Testing went in a special for the pilot. With its new J-47 engine, the Sabre set a new world's airspeed record of over 670 miles per hour. In March of 1949, the 94th Fighter Interceptor Squadron of the 1st Fighter Group received their first F-86As. The Sabre was operational. and the 94th became the world's first supersonic fighter squadron. By the eve of the Korean conflict, the F-86 was well into production, and 3 of America's 25 fighter wings took delivery of the new fighter. Korea, November 1950. When the Chinese challenged us with their new Russian-built MiG-15s, we answered by bringing in the first Sabres in a matter of days. The Chinese, though, were reported to possess as many as 1,000 MiG-15s. How could the Sabres fare against such numerical superiority? While sending waves of ground troops, which by sheer weight of numbers overran and forced United Nations troops into retreat, the Chinese and North Koreans proved cautious about challenging U.S. air superiority. Their early sorties with American flyers did not produce stunning victories. Quite the opposite, in fact, became common. Before long, the Sabre racked up a stunning kill ratio of 10-1. But even such impressive air victories could not win the war alone, and all eyes turned to the ground, where tremendous numbers of Chinese troops forced UN forces into a long march and inevitable retreat. Advanced air bases were lost as the Chinese and North Koreans advanced. The Sabre was not designed as a long-range fighter, and before the end of December, the F-86 was forced to withdraw to Japan, while C-119 flying boxcars provided supplies for the retreating troops. With the Sabre out of the picture temporarily, it was up to an assortment of Sky Raiders, Corsairs, F-9F Panther jets, and other assorted Navy aircraft to do what they could from carrier decks. B-29 raids were halted as the superforts fell prey to attacking MiGs. Navy carrier planes carried on valiantly with vigorous interdiction missions and held the air as best they could until land bases could be regained. Back in the States, there were important things to attend to. It was inevitable that venturing into a radical departure from tradition as a swept-wing design would bring with it problems and new discoveries that would take time to work out. The swept-wing concept permitted high subsonic speeds. The price was greater engine thrust and some sacrifice of low speed and high-altitude flying qualities. The initial response was to incorporate vertical wing fences, but a better solution was needed for the long run. The next significant model was the F-86D, for which design work was begun in 1949. This was to be an all-weather fighter deployed in the U.S. as a mobile airborne interceptor assigned to the Continental Air Defense Command. Unlike previous interceptor aircraft, the radar officer was eliminated, leaving the attack intercept duties to the pilot. The design featured two advanced electronic systems, the most important of which was the Hughes E-4 fire control. The E-4 had four modes: search, lock-on, fire, and pull-off. It computed distance, course, and speed of the target, placing the attacking F-86D on a collision course with the enemy aircraft. A radar scanner was installed in the nose, requiring a relocation of the air intake. The new Sabre had a distinctive look that set it apart from its immediate forebearers. Nicknamed the Dog Sabre, this beast was soon to become a familiar warbird. Designed without machine gun or cannon, the F-86D was to be armed exclusively with rockets, a first for an American fighter. Extensive testing went into perfecting the rocket firing system within the underbelly of the aircraft. When activated, it dropped 24 rockets could salvos. The 2.5-pound air-to-air rockets, each with the power of a shell, individually to shoot down The engine chosen for the D-Series Sabres was GE-17, which was fitted with an 750-pound and set the casual observer on his ear with a neck-snapping 700 top speed. During its tests, D set two world speed records, its final and fastest record being 16.697 miles per hour, set on July 16, 1953. This broke its own earlier record, 8 miles per hour, making it the first two breaking its second. In the end, 1,500 Sabres, the D served faithfully at home and abroad. Later developments along the same lines produced F-86K and L models. The K dispensed with rockets in favor of four 20mm cannons. It was powered by an afterburning J-47 GE-33 engine. One of the earliest Air Force planes to utilize post-war advances in radar, the D-Sabre led the way through the Cold War and served as an early step toward modern-day technojets with computers, advanced radar systems, and highly advanced guidance systems, keeping the U.S. Air Force constantly poised on the cutting edge of defense technology. For the basic garden variety F-86A, however, modern radar technology was of less interest. The important thing was to concentrate on perfecting a promising design into the finest fighter possible. A fighter that could meet and beat any adversary on its own terms in that classic aerial showdown with no points for second place, the dogfight. Although it was a vast improvement on what was then available, it became clear early on that the original F-86A still was not the equal, much less the better, of the MiG-15. Tiny Russian plane was light and maneuverable, possessed a powerful engine, and proved to have better high-altitude performance than the Sabre. The new American plane was a definite step in the right direction, but early Sabres were plagued with bugs and less than stunning performance in important areas. Rapid acceleration would bring a pilot into the transonic speed zone, where buffeting could cause loss of control. Tight turns at high altitude caused the plane stalls and loss of altitude. Solutions had to be found. This resulted in analysis of field data and innovative answers to achieve results. The first step in this direction was the development of a new horizontal slab tail, increasing the limited area and strength of the elevators. The elevators were replaced with an all-new flying tail, both the tailplane and elevator moving as one with increases in incidence. Inside, an entirely new control system formed the interface between the pilot and the flying surfaces. Due to high-speed maneuvering requirements of the F-86, the previous design of the manual cable pulley flight control was obsolete. The solution was a hydraulically powered surface actuation system with accompanying bell cranks and tubular push-pull linkages controlling ailerons, rudder, and elevator. Additional experimentation with air-to-air refueling was carried out, though complications precluded adding this capability to production models. Rate of climb of the new plane, dubbed the F-86E, was 7,000 feet per minute. The new Sabre was capable of Mach 0.9 at 30,000 feet. In a high-speed dive at high altitudes, it buffeted only slightly. Near Mach 1, the plane flew easily and remained under complete control. As speed was reduced over the transonic range, buffeting increased only slightly. Another significant change was in the air. As early as 1949, Canadair of Montreal had signed a contract to build 100 F-86A style Sabres for the Royal Canadian Air Force. Early in production, however, the decision was made to change these aircraft to the new E version, then in development. Shortly after Canadian production began, the United States Air Force asked Canadair to deliver 60 F-86Es to supplement their needs for Sabres in Korea. The resulting planes were used both in Korea and in Canada. So thorough was the coordination between North American and its licensee in Canada that their first F-86E flew only 2 weeks after the American-built prototype. Before production of the E version ceased, Canadair had delivered 350 planes. By late February of 1951, lost battlegrounds had been regained, and air bases were available, and the F-86 was sent in to add its might to the existing embattled forces. Back in force, the Sabres escorted B-29s on interdiction raids and regularly met the MiGs in combat. During the intervening time, units of MiG-15s had advanced their area of operations to the regions between the Yalu and Chongchon rivers in the northwestern region of North Korea, close to the Chinese border. This area became infamous as MiG Alley. Here, MiGs would take off from their conveniently out-of-bounds Chinese bases, cross the Chinese-Korean border at high altitudes, and prey on UN interdiction raids. But it was still a dangerous business for the MiGs. F-86s exacted a stunning toll on the Russian-built planes. American pilots spent a great deal of ground time speculating on the makeup of the pilots who faced them in combat. Clearly, there were inexperienced North Koreans as well as crack Chinese pilots in the MiGs. Contemporary reports suggested that their experience range ran the gamut, and increasingly frequent, though unconfirmed, reports suggested that Russian pilots unofficially took part in these attacks as well. Suspicions arose when American pilots intercepted radio communications in the Russian language, and before long, it was an open secret that fresh Russian airmen were being put into the planes that infested MiG Alley to test their skills in actual combat. No Russian pilots were ever captured, as most of this combat took place over ground held by North Korean and Chinese forces. As the war continued, F-86Es were joined by new F models with an even greater rate of climb, and air superiority stayed firmly in the UN camp. Development on the F-86F was begun, and as data from combat experience poured in, new features were planned. The need for still greater power was answered by the J-46 GE-27 engine with a new top of 6,100 pounds of thrust. Modified installations of hydraulic main and emergency system lines made susceptibility to combat damage less likely. Additional armor plating was added to protect the slab tail's actuating gear, while base structural weight was reduced wherever possible. The F raised its rate of climb to 8,000 feet per minute, and it possessed a service ceiling of 50,000 feet. In the last months of combat in Korea, the MiGs became more aggressive. The result? Their losses were staggering. In May 1953, the Sabres claimed 56 enemy aircraft downed while losing only one F-86. In June, 76 MiGs bit the dust while Sabres returned to base unscathed. Before the end of the war in late July, an additional 32 enemy fighters were destroyed by F-86Fs. Overall, the latter part of the war had seen Sabres reach an average kill ratio of 14-1, counting all models in use. The figures were in. American flyers and American designers had been challenged and had come through victorious. It is a measure of the special contribution of the North American F-86 that all 36 of the American aces to emerge from the annals of the Korean conflict had achieved their victories in Sabres. Clearly, the Sabre had succeeded in becoming the ultimate airborne weapon of its day. But the story of the Sabre does not end in 1953 with the close of hostilities in Korea. This new limited war brought with it a new Cold War of threats and tensions between superpowers. Air power had taken on a new and dramatic importance in the minds of military planners. As the ground conflict came to near stalemate during lengthy peace talks, the air war had continued unabated. Clearly, it was essential to maintain air superiority, research, the development of newer and better designs, and the continued refinement and updating of already proven aircraft. One such effort was the testing of a RATO pack. The rocket-assisted takeoff system developed for the F-86 was a specially fitted small rocket engine using liquid propellant. This single-shot device was similar to rocket and jet-powered units originally tested on F-51s. The RATO pack was expected to help shorten distances for carrier takeoffs and as a 60-second blast for speed in combat. In flight, the pilot could activate the RATO from the cockpit for a one-shot burst of power. The test project was discontinued when its actual need in combat did not justify its installation. Around the world, American allies clamored for access to the powerful protection that the Sabre would provide. Not yet 3 years after its first introduction into combat, the Sabre had proven itself as a premier frontline fighter. Before long, the Sabre would see service in foreign air forces and would find itself rolling off production lines in America, Canada, Australia, and even Italy and Japan. So the story of the Sabre continued. The F-86F was king of the high-altitude dogfight, and with more than 2,500 produced, it was destined to become the most numerous of the Sabres. Soon came the demand for a true fighter bomber. North American designers created this in the form of the F-86H. This new warbird was built around a General Electric J-73 type turbojet with 9,600 pounds of thrust, churning out 80% more power than was provided by the old J-47 engine in the F-86A. To make room for the new power plant, the fuselage of the H was deepened and the air intake enlarged. The structure and undercarriage were beefed up and an additional fuel tank placed in the fuselage. A clamshell canopy was fitted in place of the original sliding variety. The 50 caliber machine guns were eventually replaced by 4 20mm cannons. Under wing, the H typically carried bombs or 16 5-inch rockets. By 1955, Sabre production lines were winding down. Most, including the Japanese-based line, were in preparation for North American's new fighter, originally known as the Sabre 45, now given the designation the F-100 Super Sabre. In February, the Air National Guard, together with the Japanese Defense Force, placed a final order for 500 F-86Fs, making the Sabre F one of the very few fighters ever to be reinstated over a year after production had been phased out. This final run of planes can be taken as a fitting tribute to a design and a heritage. A family of planes whose genesis had begun 10 years earlier, in the final days of World War II, when a designer first drew swept-back wings on sketches of a fuselage already in development. And this was not the end. Over succeeding decades, the Sabre saw service with dozens of air forces around the world, and in some remote corners of the globe continues in active service to this day. The familiar stubby design became, through film and television, probably the most recognized jet of all time. To a generation of youngsters, the Sabre was the American jet fighter. She served her country with distinction through escort, dogfight, and interdiction. Men who flew her gave her their unwavering respect and affection. A fighting warbird known around the world as the sharpest fighter of the day, the North American Sabre, the United States Air Force F-86.